Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for my 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. Since the last project update video, a ton of work and progress has been made to the vehicle's hull. And the vehicle's hull here is almost done. Like, it is that far along. If anyone is a fan of this series, first, thank you for that. And if you're not, give us a thumb up and subscribe to the channel. But if you are a fan of the series, you'll immediately notice that the lower hull suspension is completed. And also, a good portion of the upper hull details and fittings are now out of the way. One other thing to mention is the turret. The turret has progressed quite a bit and has changed quite a bit more since the last time we seen it in the previous video. However, that is going to be the topic of its very own project update video, which would hopefully drop shortly after this one here makes its debut. As to have that information shoved into this video here, it's just going to make it way too long. So that's something that's going to be best delegated for its independent own project update video. Again, that should hopefully follow after this one. So for this one here, though, we have a ton of info to go over, bringing the hull up from the way we saw in the previous video to the way we see it now. Let's go ahead. Are you excited? I hope you are, because I know I am. Let's go ahead and get this video kicked off. Starting with the engine hatch itself, here you get to see the engine hatch well area, and it has been revised, and off camera, I went ahead and basically got it ready for mounting of the engine hatches themselves. As we saw in the previous videos, when the model was first created, the engine hatch section was integrally molded into the upper hull. Well, the sections were amputated out in preparation for the new replacement hatches to be fitted in place. And at the time I'm filming this, these adjustments have already been made off camera, but here you get to see the final outcome of it. So the hatch area, as you can see, originally had those hatches that were molded in, and those were promptly amputated out in one of the previous videos, as I mentioned before. The removal was done with the Dremel Multi-Master, which is probably the best tool for this type of a procedure because it makes a nice little straight plunge cut, and it's really the most efficient way on removing large sections like this from these models. Seriously, if you're getting into 1/6 scale scratch building or just scratch building in general, a oscillating cutting type tool like the Multi-Master or any of the other ones from Harbor Freight are beyond recommended. You will definitely thank me for that. Anyway, back to the engine hatch well here. The first thing I needed to do was to make sure I remove the right amount of material off of the side sections so that the new hatches can fit when closed. And to do that, I had to make some measurements. So what I first did was I measured the center line here of the vehicle, and I drew a little pencil line, and then I was able to take some cardboard and I was able to trace the two engine hatches side by side. So now I have the footprint of the hatches right here. I drew the center line here where the two hatches intersect, and then I was able to carefully line it up here on the hull in order for me to make the adjustments. When I placed the piece where it needed to go, with a pencil, I drew out the two sections here on either side that needed to have been deleted, and with the Multi-Master, I was able to simply just plunge cut again and just remove the extra material without any sort of problems. The procedure went by ridiculously quick, and I think within, like, 2 minutes, I was done. Here you get to see a little sliver of one of the sections that are left. So I want to say it's, about 3, maybe 4 millimeters or so, if that. Once the slivers were removed, of course, you still want to do some more hand fitting, making sure that the hatch well area is to spec and that there isn't, and also that the lines are nice and straight and even, and there's no other complications that can cause issues. Any sort of deburring or any sort of fine adjustments were done with the file over here, and I just carefully go ahead and go up and down the surfaces, carefully removing any material or particulate that remains. Also, some sandpaper was used to polish everything up for good measure. Once the hatch area is cut out completely, I then need to fabricate the hatch stops that are found on the inner portion of the well. Otherwise, the hatches will just buckle in and just collapse inside the vehicle. On the real Sherman, there would be these two sections over here because on the real Sherman, the engine hatches are held in place via 4 fasteners, 2 on each hatch, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. So there would be this inner lip over here to act as, again, a way to stop the hatches from over closing and to have as a mounting point to actually secure the hatches in place. These components over here were fabricated out of strips of sheet styrene. Basically marked it with a Sharpie, cut it with a box cutter off camera, and then I carefully marked and glued the components to the correct location. To keep everything in place while the glue set, that's what the clamps are for. Basically add the super glue and just clamp everything so it stays nice and put. Once the super glue sets, the hatch well is basically complete at this point, but there's one more procedure I want to do to add extra strength. Right now, the plastic is being held onto the fiberglass purely with super glue, and it does work, but it's more or less like a tack weld, if that. So in order to really reinforce these sections, on the inside, I am going to go ahead and mix some 2-part epoxy, and I'm going to sculpt a nice little bead, which is going to help fuse everything together, much along the lines as I've done on the bow hatch area in the previous video. However, at this time, I could go ahead and temporarily drop these components in place so you get an idea on what I was referring to. So here you get to see the one intake goes here, and the other one goes right here. And that looks a hell of a lot better compared to the original hatches that we found on the model. Or I should say the original hatches that were molded onto the rear engine deck on the model. Case in point, we have the original ones right here. So if you look at this, you're going to think that these sections here are just bars that go across the rear engine deck section. Well, that's not the case. As I mentioned before, on the M4A3, and same is also true for the M10, the M4A2, the M36, even the M26 Pershings, what you see are not bars. Those are actually well beads. And it's just used to just hold all these little thin little slats in place. And the slats, again, are not really well rendered out on almost all the kits on the market. As for why this is done, on smaller scale builds, it's generally done for production reasons. It's easier to produce something like this than try to make something like that. But the point does still stand. In the past, when I was working on these vehicles, I was always one that would modify the rear engine hatches because I would always make them work. In the past, to do this, I would take this section over here, carefully amputate the middle areas, and then just rebuild the center sections out of slats of brass, and then solder them together with other methods. And it was always a huge pain in the ass. I'm not going to lie. It was one of the features found on the Shermans, on these M4A3s, that I really hated to do because, again, it was very time-consuming to go ahead and carefully cut out every one of these little brass strips to the appropriate size, make sure they properly fit, make sure they're jigged all right, and then go ahead and do the mounting. And then on an M4A3 specifically, it was a double whammy because not only did I have to worry about the external sections, but I also had to do the internal ductwork as well. It was really beautiful once it was complete, don't get me wrong. It's really rewarding to work so hard on something than to have it come out perfect and then you see it in the end result. But it was definitely a huge relief when I finally was able to have these components here designed up, and now they are in hand as a single piece, and I don't have to do really any sort of fabrication on them. And the pieces still look absolutely beautiful. So again, it's definitely a case of having your cake and eating it too. The only thing that needs to be added to complete the hatch installation are the mounting of the hinges themselves, which of course I have off camera and I'm going to be taking care of in a moment. Continuing a little further down the road takes to the point we're at here, where the last of the rear engine deck revisions have been made, some more fittings have been added, and at this point here, the model can actually slide off into paint, or at least the upper can get primed, and the lower hull can receive its weathering, as well as some touch-ups with its base coat. I'm going to bring the camera closer so you get to see and appreciate some more of the work that was done to this area here. With the camera readjusted, you get a better idea on the detailing that has been added and replaced in this location over here. As a quick recap, on the rear portion of the Sherman tank, there is this bullet splash guard that protects the neck of the turret from any sorts of shrapnel or bullets or any other type of physical impediments that can potentially cause issues. And on the sides, we have these large casted sections. However, on the rear, we have this type of setup that we have in front of you. And also, as a quick recap, the model originally had these sections integrally molded into the upper hull. However, they were a bit amorphous and a bit basic. And in those previous videos, I went ahead and deleted these sections over here and went through the process of doing the bodywork, squaring it off in preparation for the replacements. And here you can see the replacements now fitted in place. All of the details you see here were fabricated out of evergreen styrene strips, specifically number 189. And for the ones here on the rear portion of the hull, and also for the wall here that's found on the engine hatch, or the engine deck, I should say, these here are doubled up in order to achieve the proper width that was found on the real one. Two sections were simply glued together, and then once the glue set, I added a smear of red putty on, polished everything down with the sandpaper so it's nice and smooth. With the seam then deleted, I then went ahead and carefully marked the locations, and then added the little bends that you see here on either side. With the camera off the tripod, you get a better idea on exactly what the geometry of the pieces look like. In order to achieve the bend, once I had the line marked off, I went ahead, put the piece in the vise, hit it with a heat gun, and then once the plastic became nice and pliable, I was able to just simply bend it to the shape that we see here. Once the bend was achieved, it was then time for installation. On this one over here, I did have to make this little cutout on this section in order for clearance of the fire extinguisher box, which is not yet glued on, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. And then once that was achieved, then the piece was just glued in place, and then the sculpted well beads were then added. The well beads were added to the bottom location, as well as also the portion where it goes upward and makes contact here with the side splash rim. For the unit in the center, this again was just two strips glued together, seam work removed, and then this was secured and mounted to the rear engine deck area in the appropriate location. Once this was fitted in place, it was then time to fabricate this little fella that we have over here, and this is just a single piece of the same stock, again heated and bent to the appropriate shape that you see presently. One thing to pay attention to when you're working on these type of Shermans is that this piece and this piece are not making contact with one another, and there is a gap in between the two. The other thing to address or mention is that this piece here is actually affixed to the engine deck and not the rear hull, while these two extenders here on either side are vice versa. If you look at the model over here, I carefully went ahead and illustrated this by having the slit line here for the engine deck removable hatch that is present, and it's also present on the reverse side. And it just gives you that accurate bit of detailing, which of course would be found on the real one. The only thing missing at this time is a gutter, where it's a small little hole drilled into this section over here. This will be addressed shortly after the filming of this scene, and also this applies to the gutters here found on the sides, and also on the rear fuel tank guard as well. As for the fire extinguisher box, well, you can see that it's housed in this little protective box that we have over here. This is just fabricated out of some brass strip that I had. I cut it to the appropriate width, bent it, and then secured it to the model. Once the sculpted well beads were added, the installation for the piece is complete. The only thing that remains is the installation of this little fellow over here. The reason why I have not mounted him at this time just yet, because I want to thoroughly get this section primed and painted prior to installation, just so everything has a thorough coat of paint on it. It's a little tricky to get with all of its nooks and crannies in this type of format, but at least you get an idea of exactly what it's going to look like when it's completed. Panning over to the right takes us to the rear blower. This is the old school cast resin one that has been on the catalog forever now, and for the time being it's going to stay for a little while until the mold eventually wears out, but as I stated before, the piece is good enough for the job at hand and does give some very nice detail fidelity to this area. As I may have mentioned before or in a previous video, this is an off-casting piece. It's one of those ones I had lying around my spare bin. It wasn't good enough for sale for customer builds, but for my own personal build here, it's more than suffice. Went ahead, cleaned it up, sanded it down, and the piece now just is living in this little section here of this model. Also fitted at this time are the fuel filler caps, as well as their identification markers. The pieces, of course, are fully functional. If you pull the pin, the unit hinges open, and we have the detailing underneath. Uh-oh! What's this you see here? The model has reverted back to dead bug mode. However, looks are most certainly deceiving because the model is very different now compared to the way it was the previous time it was seen on this series in the same type of position. After the details were mounted onto the upper hull, as I mentioned before, the model was then taken outdoors where I was able to fully de-dust it, which was why, by the way, I made the cuts and the other mods in the previous scenes. And after the model was de-dusted, the entire upper hull was primed, and then I went ahead and added some touching up of the base coat to the lower extremities. If we recall, since the model was painted, I actually went ahead and did some more details to the lower sponson sections, such as the well beads, as well as the fuel tank fasteners found on the side wall. And because of those details that were added, I needed to touch up these locations, which necessitated me to reapply some paint in some locations. Oh, also the side skirt rails. That was another big one that was added since the previous scene. Anyway, after the model received the base coat, it was then time to go ahead and complete the weathering on the lower extremities. This was again done because after this point here, the model's going to be flipped right side up, and it's never going to be flipped over again. So get one last good look at this thing before we go ahead and flip it over in perpetuity. And if you're asking yourself, well, John, why is the model not going to be flipped over again? Well, like I may have mentioned several times already, the model being 1/6 scale, it's a bit heavier and a little bit more cumbersome compared to your little 135s or your 116s. And the problem is, if you go ahead and fully detail and flesh out the upper hull extremities without thoroughly painting and weathering the hull, or if you're going to save this for the end like you would on a smaller scale model, the issue arises where the details are pretty frail, and you can easily just break them from just handling this thing and flipping it around, and not to mention putting it on a styrofoam block on the table. So it's best to go ahead and deal with this now, and then when it comes time to paint the remainder of the model to mask up this section thoroughly, than it is to go ahead and try to flip this thing and paint it during that type of a painting procedure. So this is one of those things where when you're working at 1/6 scale and larger, you need to have that in mind. On 116, it's not really a problem. 135 and smaller, obviously, definitely not an issue. But when you go to the single-digit scales, that's when you need to start thinking outside the box like that. Another reason why I had to go ahead and do all the weathering at this time involves the exhaust manifold area. You'll see that the exhaust manifolds have thoroughly been weathered at this point with their rust effects as well as their exhaust soot effects, and the reason why I have to do this now involved the exhaust blower grill. As I mentioned before, this needed to have been thoroughly primed and painted, not to mention weathered, prior to installation, and once this thing is fit in place, you're not really going to have access to go ahead and add the weathering to these locations over here, even with the thing folded and tucked away. So it's best to go ahead and take care of this now, and as opposed to later. As for the grill itself, I did show this in a previous video, but here you get to see the grill now in its completed format. Note on the rear sections over here where we have the exhaust cutouts, we have the soot effects applied to these two locations. And on the front section, you will also have some soot effects here on the lower portion of the grill. And this is important to mention, as this is another mistake a lot of people make out there on their smaller scale builds, is when you're weathering the exhaust on an M4A3 with this type of flip grill, note the cutouts are only on the bottom portion. So it's only this little vent here and this vent here where the exhaust smoke will actually emanate from. And so because of that, when you have fouling and charring type effects, it would only be in these locations here and not on the entire grill, as what is commonly seen on smaller scale models. Or I should say on most models that are out there. So it's again one of those little detail factoids you want to bear in mind when you're working on an M4A3 like this. Of course, with the weathering out of the way, this bad boy could finally be mounted in place. From the exhaust deflector takes us back to the bogie housings. If I go ahead and bring the camera in lower, well, you also get to see the fuel tank fasteners that I mentioned in the previous video. On the bogies themselves, you can see that I went ahead and thoroughly added all of the panel line accent to the locations, which I'm not going to lie was something that was a bit tedious. As you can imagine, these things have lots and lots and lots of nooks and crannies, and that's just on one unit, and then you have to repeat that same exact procedure 6 more times. So yeah, it's definitely one that you need to pace yourself on, but the final outcome once completed definitely looks the part. On the return rollers, of course, it would not be an ECA Sherman video if I didn't mention, return rollers are steel on VVSS Shermans, and they polish down very, very quickly in field. So this is just silver paint that has just been applied to these surfaces here with a paintbrush. There's a lot of individuals out there that like to paint these black, thinking they're rubber or something, and that's just not the case. Not on a VVSS Sherman. HVSS, yes. VVSS, no. Also on this portion here, again, wouldn't be an ECA video if I didn't mention about the Zerk fittings found on the return rollers. There's 2 of them, and they have been painted in red, as which is usually done. The only thing that's not done yet weathering-wise is the adding of the silver scratched effects or polished down effects on the top portion of the skid rails. That is going to be done, but I have to have the tank flip right side up in order to do so. Trying to do it upside down is a bit problematic. Back to the bogie housings, you got to see the springs, all of the knuckle and pivot swing arm sections. These things are just jam-packed with nooks and crannies and cast numbers, and yeah, that panel line accent just loves to go in there. Also on the front section over here, you get to see the final drives with the same weathering effects that have been added. The sprockets are not yet weathered at this time. Those are going to be weathered as the build continues and more towards the end of the build, as since those pieces are removable, there's no point doing the weathering at this time on those. But rest assured, that is something that is going to come as the video continues. Or I should say, as the video series continues, not in this video. And I just love the final drives with those ribs. It just looks so cool, and it feels really good to finally have these on the ECA catalog. Not to mention being fitted to my build. Love it. You will definitely be seeing those several more times as builds continue, shall I say. As I also referenced in the previous video, the Sherman side skirt rail has these bosses that are basically spot and tack welded on. And now that the model is fully painted and weathered, with the weld beads no less, you get to really appreciate the detailing it gives the under portion here of the sponson. It really does kick it up to another level. Same is also true for the 3 on the rear mud flap mount, as you can see. With the grille fitted in place, the very last thing I'm going to mount to the hull at this time prior to the flip are going to be the row wheels. Usually the row wheels I mount at the very tail end of the build. However, for this one over here, I'm going to mount them on at this point since I'm going to be masking up the entire lower hull. Anyway, the row wheels will be plenty protected from any sort of overspray that can potentially harm them. Also, these things have been lingering and cluttering around the shop, and I want to go ahead and fit them on just to protect them from any sort of damage or getting lost or any wacky stuff that can potentially happen between now and when the model is ready for painting. The model does become a little bit more cumbersome with the wheels fitted in place, generally speaking, because on the past builds they were made out of cast resin. However, these things being 3D printed are much lighter, so I don't predict there's going to be really too much of a extra cumbersome factor with the model with the wheels fitted in place. So we're going to get them fit on at this time. One other reason why I want to fit them on at this time is it makes lining up the pins easier in this format as opposed to when the thing is right side up. It becomes a little bit more problematic. So again, it just has a little bit more benefits this way as opposed to the other. To mount the wheels in place, I have here the steel rods. I went ahead and cut these off camera. 1/4 inch steel bar stock that was cut to length, so we have now some shafts. I went ahead and turned the shafts on the lathe with some sandpaper just to polish them down, remove any sort of oil or other residue on the surface. These things, of course, are hot rolled steel, so you do have that oxide on them, and that was go ahead and polished off, so it makes the installation go by a little bit easier. From this point on, however, I am going to go ahead and mask up the center portion so I can get the ends painted so that when I slip them in place, you don't have any bare exposed steel popping through. And here's the model with the grill work now fitted in place. As for the installation, well, it went smooth as silk since I went ahead and shown the installation procedure in the previous video. I just went ahead and repeated those steps, but now with a coat of paint added. The grill is still fully functional, as you can see. This is it in its deployed state, and here we have it in its retracted state. With the camera readjusted, I wanted to mention an alteration that I had to make to the weathering, which was something I originally missed when I added the weathering in the previous scenes. And that has to do with the exhaust soot fouling right here on the rear portion here of the rear hull. When the grill was first fitted in place and I was looking at it, I noticed that I had a gap in the weathering where I had the exhaust soot effects here added to the exhaust manifolds and to the rear portion here of the deflector grill, but on the upper rear area here of the hull, it was totally naked. And this was something that stood out like a sore thumb, and it was something that I wanted to address ASAP. And of course, with the model upside down now, I was able to take advantage of it. So I took some paper, literally this one right here, I shoved it into this little gap with the grill work folded up, which does, again, make things a bit easier. And I went ahead and threw some Tamiya flat black into the airbrush, and I applied it to the appropriate locations surgically, and with the mask with the paper in the way, it prevented any sort of overspray to occur. Now that the weathering is added, the piece is complete and looks much better compared to the way we had it before. The only other thing that's needed to be added to the model to complete the rear section here, aside from the rear idler wheels, is the tow hitch. The tow hitch, of course, is something that I do have. It's actually on hand and it's ready for painting. However, you'll notice it's not fitted to the model at this point, and the reason is quite simple. That piece is very snag prone, and it's also something that can be susceptible for damage. So that's a bit of equipment I usually fit to the model at the very tail end of the build, because at that point there, the risk of snagging it and breaking it are much more reduced compared to with the way the condition the model is right now. However, rest assured, that is something that, of course, is going to be added to the model, and it will be something that I'll mention in a future video close to the completion of the build entirely. Moving forward a little bit takes to the point where we see here where the wheels are being fitted in place. One whole side has already been completed, and basically the second side is just about done with one more bogie housing remaining. For the axles, you can see a prepped one right over here. Notice I went ahead and masked up the center portion, so I was able to get the flat black primer onto the areas on the end. And this was done for the same reasons that I mentioned on the other earlier video for the swing arms. It allows the piece to slide in better where the piece needs to rotate. There's less paint buildup, so it's easier to function. And on top of that, where there is paint, it's nice and snug on the locations where it needs to be. Even though it's nice and snug, oh, and one other thing, it has the primer on it, so it makes painting and touching up a bit easier, which is something I have to do now. And it's actually a good thing that I'm installing them at this time as opposed to the tail end of the build, where trying to paint these things from under the hull is a bit problematic. So after the wheels are fitted in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a drop of the really thin super glue that I have around here somewhere. Ah, here it is. A little drop of this. I'm going to Ninja Poison a little drop into each one of these little sections over here where it makes contact with the 3D printed swing arm, and that'll ensure that it solidifies and keeps it in place forevermore. Even though the model is static, I don't have to worry about these pieces working loose in operation or anything like an RC model. It's just good to have a little drop of glue on these sections here just to really make sure that nothing can move or shift even when the model's just sitting around. The other thing I'm going to do once the CA drives is to paint these sections here with a little swipe of olive drab so everything blends in. On the installation itself, I went ahead and had to open up the tolerances on both the wheels and the swing arms with the 1164 drill bit right over here. I threw it in the drill. First I threw it in the drill press. I was able to carefully drill out the center portions of the row wheels. That's best on a drill press because it's nice and true. You don't want it to be canted. For the swing arms themselves, I'm able to carefully do that with the drill. You drill those out because even though the holes were kind of drilled out with the same bit originally, with the amount of paint that builds and primer that builds up, it constricts the tolerances and it makes insertion of the pins, specifically with paint on them, much more difficult. And the last thing you want to do is go through all this only to break something. So that is definitely something to be aware of. Nothing much more to discuss here. Let me just go ahead and continue what I just described. And after about 5 minutes or so, brings us to the point we're at now, where not only are all of the row wheels fitted in place, but the super glue was tacked into all of the appropriate locations, and the locations that were bare metal, or I should say the exposed sections of the rods, have now been painted with the base and the weathering. So at this point here, the lower hull's finished. You hear that? Lower hull, done. The only thing that's absent at this point are the idlers. Those are painted, by the way. Those are going to be fitted permanently at the tail end of the build because I need to adjust the track tension, and with the way those are designed, you need to go ahead and have the track on the tank, and you can go ahead and set the tension in order to get the track where it needs to be. The sprockets, again, those are painted at this moment and are going to be weathered as the build continues. But for the tank being upside down to dead bug mode, that's it. Get one last good look at this thing, because after this thing will never be in this position, more likely ever again. With the camera off the tripod, you get a better idea on what the final underhull detailing and paintwork looks like. As for the suspension of course is workable. So you see how the wheels roll, and you can see the swing arms in actuation. And yes, they do have spring bounce to them, as was mentioned in a previous video. This is going to look awesome once the tank is finished and it's placed on uneven terrain. Like I always reference in these videos, on 1/6 scale models, even static ones, it's good to have a working suspension because it really gives you lots of benefits. It makes the tank look more realistic when placed outdoors, in an outdoor setting. But also, it makes the model more durable because when you're setting the tank down, you might set it down unevenly. And if you have all of the weight of the heavy model on one swing arm or one little portion over here, that can potentially cause damage. If there's some flex or spring to it, obviously it's going to absorb that when the tank is being placed down. Also, like I mentioned before with the uneven terrain, again, same rule applies. If you have a heavy model placed on uneven terrain and all of the tank's load is being distributed on one frail suspension piece, that can also lead to breakage and issues. So even though the tank is static, a working suspension in 1/6 scale is definitely one that is optimal. And now the model's looking more appropriate, being flipped right side up. Since the model was rotated, I went ahead and painted the skid rails and the return rollers, and, well, let me bring the camera closer so you get a better idea of what I'm referring to. Well, as it turns out, it's really tricky to get these camera angles here on the tripod, so we're just going to have to roll freehand. Either way, you can see the top portion here of the skids, and they have been painted with the silver paint. The silver paint's the exact same paint that I utilized on the return rollers that you see right next to it. This is one of those locations that almost everybody misses on their small-scale Sherman builds. Even some of the most thorough builders out there still miss this little bit of detailing on their builds. And it's one that's easily overlooked, but if you go ahead and add it, it just adds a little bit extra more accuracy and realism to the model compared to just leaving it forgotten. As one would imagine, these locations here really serve one job, and that's just to support the track. And with their location, obviously, it doesn't take much of a distance for the pieces to strip any paint off and to polish down, essentially to the way we see it here. This is one of those effects that's easily added, and once added, again, just makes the model look that much more polished. Needless to say, it is a mirror image on the opposite side, done with the exact same technique. While the detail fittings are being fitted to the model, that brings us these two accessories over here, and these two have kind of leapfrogged the remainder of the build, where they're totally done. Like, they are literally finished, and just waiting for the rest of the tank to catch up. Obviously, what we have here is the fire extinguisher box and the travel lock, and the reason why I went with this format as opposed to my usual method where I just mount it to the model and just work and paint around it is because of the nooks and crannies that these things have. It's easier to go ahead and do it in this format as opposed to the other. And if I go ahead and flip this thing over, you'll see what I mean. So with the component flipped around, you can see that it's got a lot of little paint traps in here, and trying to get the paint and the weathering in here, it's a bit challenging to do when fitted in place. You kind of have to work around here with the thing flipped up, with the hull in the way. It's not exactly easily done. The hinges are still going to be mounted to the model as well as the hatch retention clip, and since this thing is just held in place with 2 pins, I could go ahead and temporarily pin it in place, secure the hinges in the feet where they need to go. Once the glue sets, pop the pins, and then I could continue with the remainder of the build without any issues. So it doesn't really change anything on the build by doing it in this format. Same is also true for the fire extinguisher box. Remember, we saw it in that little well that we had before. Well, when it's in the well, you're gonna have difficulty getting paint into the right location. So it's, again, best done to go ahead and paint and weather it without the piece fit in place at this time, and then at the very end of the build, drop it in and call it a day. But we do have the opportunity to thoroughly look at these components now in their final format. Here you can see the front portion with all of the chipping and the other type of weathering that has been applied. And if I flip it to the back side here, you get to appreciate, again, all of the other details I was referencing before, but now, in its final format, you really get to appreciate it just all that much more. Like, for instance, the cast number here is in much more definition and light. The sliding block still has a bit of weathering. That's the Tamiya panel line accent still setting on it. So I'll go ahead and let that dry. Piece, of course, still fully actuates, as we saw earlier. And on the fire extinguisher box, with its handles now fitted, it's really going to jump out at you. So hopefully with this lighting I have, you could see the legible manufacturer information on the box itself. And also you could see on the red painted fire extinguisher handles the information, which is also fully legible, which should read fire pull hard. This just gives so much detailing and life to the part, and like I mentioned before, without this type of technology, it would be almost impossible to make a part like this with this type of detailing on it with this quality. So it's definitely, let's just say, like I mentioned before, this one here is a worthy successor to the old cast resin counterpart. From the suspension brings us to the rear plate over here, and as you can see, it's been fleshed out with its details. Essentially, this area of the build is completed. The only bit of work that needs to be done are some weld beads that need to be sculpted on the retention wing nuts for the rack, and you'll see what that looks like momentarily. But for basic components, what you see here is essentially what you get. Starting with the track racks, here you get to see one of the corner units fitted in place. The unit is fully functional, as you can see. The piece is just hinged downward. The securing fasteners are not fitted on at this time, but obviously they are off camera, and when the time comes, they will be mounted on permanently. Also, you can see, obviously, that they are functional. We have 3 spare track links fitted in place. These are the Dragon ones, but these will work on any 1/6 scale VVSS Sherman track link, be it from ECA, the old Panzerwerk ones, even the plastic Panzer ones. The unit, because it is not connected to one another, basically can use, again, any of the units that I just referenced. So when it comes for securing them in place, you want to make sure that you find the location exactly where it needs to be, and you fasten it or secure it to the model. In this case here, it's just glued on. There's no other fasteners that are required. Just some super glue is really all you need. Once the unit is put in place, it's nice and square, you then take 3 track links and you essentially slide them in and you use them as a jig. This is done so that you know exactly where the second unit needs to go. So basically you slide the 3 track links in, you take the other side, add some glue to it, line it up, and just drop it where it needs to go. Within about a couple minutes or so, as long as everything is lined up accordingly, you'll have the piece fitted on in the appropriate manner. Also, when it comes to the Dragon track link specifically, we have the kit one here with the integrally molded on snaps that are still present. These are going to be removed, and I'm going to be going over this in more depth in a future video. But needless to say, for this project over here, even with the stock snaps, this does not affect or inhibit any way the functionality or the installation of the parts. The ECA parts can still be installed on without any sort of issues, with or without the stock snaps still present. This brings us to the rear folding rack. In the current position, the rack is displayed in its collapsed state and is also stowed to the vehicle. If I try to lift it, it's not exactly going to move. And if I try to open it, it's also in the locked position. The stave mount is again also secured. If I go ahead and wiggle this wing nut free, the piece hinges open. And at this point here, I could go ahead and remove or install the cleaning staves, which is again something I am going to be doing, but at a later date. For now, let me just go ahead and pin this guy closed again. In order to open up the rack, this is of course done with these 2 little wing nuts that we have here and here, as I mentioned before, but here you can see what they look like fitted in place. At the moment, again, they are securing this thing in the closed position, and if I want to open it, well, on the real one, you would undo the wing nut a couple threads, this loosens it up, and then you could lift it out of the little slot that's integrally cut into the rack itself. This one here, a little similar, but you don't need to necessarily unthread everything, just simply flip upward these 2 pieces, like so, and now the rack can hinge open. Because of the design of the rack, with these 2 support arms that we have on either side, it's very self-supporting, and you can go ahead and put several objects on the inside rack over here for good measure. Now, obviously, for display of the model, no, you're not going to use a bottle of super glue or 2 bottles of Tamiya paint. You would use things that are more appropriate, like a jerry can or some bags or ammo cans or thing along those lines. Well, hey, actually, you know what? Wait a minute. Silly me. As it turns out, I just noticed on the corner of my eye that I have 3 ECA 3D printed fuel jerry cans on stock. And you can see what they look like fitted to the rack. These, of course, are listed on the ECA catalog. No, I am not going to utilize these on this build over here. I don't like equipment on my models, as I mentioned before. But either way, boo as much as you want. You get an idea exactly how the piece looks like. And if you like jerry cans on your Sherman so much, well, go to the ECA catalog while you're building your 1/6 scale Sherman, get the rack, as well as the jerry cans, and you could go ahead and outrig your vehicle to your heart's content. Oh, and I also have the straps too. That's another thing that's often on the catalog. Alright, so shameless plug out of the way. So you get to see what it looks like with those components fit in place. However, at the moment, the rack is actually, again, in the locked position. Because, again, if you have stuff on the rack itself and the tank is in operation, you don't want this thing flopping around on you. Well, here you get to see, well, let me move the camera because it's currently held in place with two wing nuts that are on the sides here. With the camera readjusted, this is one of the units over here, but it's, again, a mirror image on the opposite side. You can see that once the piece is fitted in place, it prevents the unit from going up and down. If I go ahead and flip this guy downward, like so, we can do the same thing with the one on the opposite side right now. Once those are disengaged, you can then lift the rack clean up, which, as you can see, can be done extremely easily. With the units out of the way, you can see the wing nut and their mounts secured to the rear portion here of the hull. Now, on some Shermans, there is a starter crank located in this location over here. However, on the Jumbo, as far as I was able to read, that is not the case. Later production M4A3s, they went ahead and removed that bit of equipment, so it's not found on this example. But perhaps on some earlier versions of the M4A3, this was something that was a thing, which necessitated the whole reason why the rack needed to flip upward to begin with. But either way, with the rack flipped out of the way, here you get to see the units here in better light. The units themselves are just glued to the model. However, I did mark and drill a hole into the plate in order to seat the piece in place. This gives a little bit of extra added strength. The only thing that's missing at this time are some weld beads that I am going to be sculpting on the top and the bottom, but this will be done the next time I go ahead and add some more accessories to the hull, which will be actually fairly soon. It's also at this time you get to really appreciate that standoff that I mentioned before on the rear rack, and once the thing is hinged downward, it bottoms out at just the right location, which again is important to prevent it from just lying flat on the rear portion of the hull, and it's also ideal for the wing nuts then to latch onto the rack here at just the right height, again once clamped down, preventing the piece from bouncing around. Moving topside, you can see the hinges here, and the hinges are held in place with not just adhesives, but each of them have 4 tiny brass fasteners that are also used to help secure them to the deck. And the brass fasteners are included with the sets. However, this is subject to change because in recent years, trying to track down these small brass fasteners here in the quantities and the sizes that I need has been actually quite increasingly difficult, to the point where I may have to stop offering them altogether in favor of replacing them with 3D printed units. The printed ones would be the same material that I use for the rack itself, so they are plenty durable, or durable enough for this type of application. However, this is the situation that I'm increasingly approaching. But for the time being, I do have enough on stock to do a few more of these sets. So if you want one with the metal fasteners, you might want to get the set sooner than later. But back to the set over here. So these are, again, held in place, and the fasteners are actually not threaded on or held on with nuts. I basically just drill a hole almost the same size of the fastener itself, and then it's driven into the fiberglass here with some adhesives, and that's more than enough, combined with the friction with the super glue, to keep the thing rock solid. And as you can see, the piece isn't going anywhere. Also, with the way everything is lined up, again, the hinging is absolutely perfect, and there's no snagging or twisting or yawing or anything like that. The hinge installation is absolutely perfect. Moving up brings us to the rear tow cable lock, and here you get to see the unit that I mentioned before, but now fully primed and fitted to the model. Just like as we saw before, for the installation, you need to mark a small little area, drill a hole into the model, and then the piece just drops in with a little bit of super glue. The piece is still fully functional, as you can see. If I go ahead and loosen this guy up, slide him out of the way, and then the piece can hinge open without any sort of issues. Unlike the rear plate, where that's essentially completed, on this area here, there's still some more detail things that still need to be added, such things like the tail light, brush guard, and the lift ring, to name a few. But again, this will be discussed in more depth in an upcoming video. But for the time being, what you see here is what I have installed. From the clasp brings us to the rear engine deck, and as you can see, this has fleshed out quite nicely. So you can see those fasteners that I was referencing before, they have been primed and then fitted to the model in the appropriate locations. The locations were carefully marked and drilled, as I mentioned earlier, and then you just got to drop these components in, and once all set, it completes the look that you see here. In addition to securing them to the engine deck itself, I also use the exact same faux fasteners for the engine grills. Originally, these would have had metal fasteners, i.e. M3 fasteners, for the mounting. However, as I referenced earlier, the M3 fastener, in my opinion, although it works, it's a bit on the overscaled side. So in order to keep continuity, I just went ahead and simply replaced those with these ones. And the best part is I had to do no modifications to the grill whatsoever. I just dropped these components in without any sort of issues. They drop into the stock holes, and what you see here is the end result. Of course, the hinges can, or I should say the engine hatch can still hinge open without any sort of issues. The only thing that you do need to do, though, is add the holes here on the stop, which you need to do anyway, because again, on the real Sherman, you would have real locations like this so that you can actually bolt the thing to the engine deck. On that note, later Shermans, specifically in the post-war years, they had their engine deck revised where they had these two quick release levers found in the front and on the back section. And although those are really cool, those are something that are, again, a post-war add-on and are not something that were seen on World War II vehicles. So if you see any Sherman M4A3 specifically with the locks in these sections over here, or also with the redesigned hinge where later, again, Shermans, they redesigned their engine grills where they got rid of these 4 hinges and have one continuous long hinge with a torsion bar for ease to help opening up the hatches, make it a little bit less of a labor-intensive affair. That's all awesome and all, but all of those details I reference are again a post-World War II modification. So again, if you're working on your Sherman and you're using one as reference and you see those, pump your brakes. Those are not World War II spec. And that is the perfect point to bring us to this little area over here, and it's one that I forgot to mention earlier in the video. And when it comes to M4A3 rear engine decks, there were 2 patterns available. You had the single rear engine deck, and then you have what's referred to as the split rear engine deck, and this one here is representing the latter. The difference is quite simple. On the earlier versions of the M4A3, the engine deck itself was one continuous piece, where you undo these fasteners over here, and then the entire engine deck simply lifts up, and now you have access to the engine, the radiators, the fuel tanks, and all the other instruments and things that are inside the rear engine bay. Well, at some point in the Sherman tank's production, they decided to go ahead and revise that, where instead of having it be one continuous panel, they decided to go ahead and split it, where we have one larger panel here that facilitates the coolant fluid cap as well as the engine hatches, but then have a smaller access panel in the back that gets access to the radiators. And why this, I guess, was done or thought to be feasible was in case you need to get access to just the radiators, it's much easily done by just removing these few fasteners here and then removing this little plate as opposed to removing the whole thing. So it makes access and maintenance a bit easier as well as faster. So I could see why they went ahead and had the idea to do that. Either way, the vehicles that had the split engine deck are very distinctive because one, there's the thing is split, but there's this little strip of steel found in this section over here, and this is basically an overlapping lip that is found on the radiator portion of the access panel, and it just basically sits on top of the engine deck over here, and once fastened in place, it keeps everything solid. And you will have a strip here, but you will still see the 2 sections on the ends where the slit for the 2 hatches is still remaining. This was done because of the fasteners that we have here. Another difference is that the split deck has more fasteners found in this section, as the other one only has 1 fastener here in the center, so there's 3 total, but on the split one, there's now 4. So they subdivided this section over here to have an extra fastener to help secure the engine deck in place, and another fastener helps to secure the sliver in place. What's currently missing are two little handles found in these two sections over here. These are going to be added and are something that's going to be, again, mentioned in an upcoming video. Now, why all of that roundabout info is important is because this tank is a jumbo, and why that's relevant is that all of the jumbos that were ever produced featured the split engine deck. More than likely, what happened was by the time the jumbo was approved and entered into production, the production line for standard M4A3s already fully switched over to split engine deck, and so the jumbo just acquired this in that type of manner. So again, if you're working on a jumbo, regardless of scale, be sure to add the split engine deck here to your build. Moving upward, you can see the filler caps that have been fitted in place. These at the moment have been pre-painted and weathered, both inside and out, and are currently just placed on here temporarily. Because these are pre-painted and weathered, I'm going to go ahead and mount them permanently at the very tail end of the build, just to prevent any sort of issues with overspraying and things like that. This is basically going to be like cake dressing at the end of the build. Similar is also true to the fire extinguisher box, where, as you can see right here, what it looks like fitted in place. Which, as a side note, you can see looks really awesome right there in that little well section. And those little handles painted red really just jump out at you with the legible information and everything. But again, just like with these guys, it's currently not glued on and will be just dropped in this section over here at the very tail end of the build. With the camera off the tripod, you get an idea of what I'm referring to with trying to wet paint and weather this area over here. It's much easily done getting in here with access with the paint, as opposed to something like this that, yeah, I guess it's doable, but it's a little bit more problematic. It's definitely easier in this type of a manner. Back to the filler spouts, these sections here do require a little bit more paint work, but again, this will be done at the tail end of the build. And also with these pieces not fit in place, it makes getting in here with the paintbrush and also with the other techniques that are required a bit more easier. Continuing down the side of the model over here, you can see the tow cable cleat fitted in place. This, of course, is the new one that was mentioned before. And moving forward even further brings us to the other unit fitted here on the front. Nothing much more needs to be said about that. Circling around brings us back to the fuel caps. One thing that I forgot to mention before is how the inner components are fitted in place. The way this is done is that you need to mark the locations, you drill out the portion with the drill bit, and then the cap gets glued in from the inside. Once the cap is positioned in place for extra strength, I went ahead and mixed some 2-part epoxy and flared it in, much along the lines I mentioned in the previous video on the front bow hatch area, and also in this video here with the supports that hold up the engine grill. And on that note, when I was drilling them out, I actually ran into an issue where the bit was giving me a little bit of problems where it was bent, and because of that, it was making the holes slightly wider than it needed to be. So what I went ahead and did was I took a PVC tube and I went ahead and basically used that as a liner to slip in to shrink the size of the hole into a hole that's the appropriate diameter. This did twofold. One, it made the piece nice and clean on the outside with a little bit of bodywork. It was polished down, but also it made the fiberglass much more clean. If you ever have to drill through anything that's made out of fiberglass cloth, you'll know that you always have a few little flingings running around, and it's something that it's a little bit of a chore to have to deal with. Well, with the sleeve, it eliminates that completely. Although, to be fair, on this one here, the weave wasn't really that bad, but again, it was more had to do with the size of the hole that was used on the drill bit. Anyway, on that note, this brings us to the center cap that we have here for the water. And the keen-eyed amongst you might notice something, and that is the piece is not square, and this is done on purpose. I don't want to see anyone try to, well, actually me in the comment section, because no, you are wrong. The piece is not symmetrical, and every single model out there screws this up, believe it or not. This was something that I myself didn't even realize until, again, I saw the real one. So much so, I'm going to go ahead and post some receipts. Right here on this side of the screen, you're going to see a photograph of the real vehicle that I took, and as you can also clearly see, the fluid filler cap is indeed off-center. It's canted to the left. And this is actually done on purpose. The reason why this is the case has to do with the design of the pin. With the length of the pin, if you go ahead and center this thing, it's going to be really difficult to remove the pin. So what they went ahead and did was they off-centered the piece, so this allows clearance for you to manipulate the pin in order to get the thing hinged open. And the model over here, I wanted to replicate that. So the way we had before, as we can recall, I went ahead and drew a pencil line on the center portion of the model, and with that I was able to then index the piece appropriately shifted and canted to the left. And what's funny was that I marked it. I even did a little tick mark so that the drill bit can go ahead and find the correct location. However, as it turns out, even the drill bit believes the fuddler that these things are centered, because with the way that drill bit was wobbling, by the time I was done drilling the hole, it actually centered the damn thing. So the very first time you have a drill bit that goes off the hole that you wanted, it actually puts it dead center in the middle of the plate. It was a bit frustrating, to say the least. Like, seriously? But I was able then to go ahead and drill out the hole wider, make the sleeve, and then I was able to plug it all up with the bodywork. And now that the piece is all done, you can see what it looks like canted and shifted to the appropriate direction. It's not by much, but it's just enough that will trigger some people out there. If they see it, they're going to be like, aha! He screwed up. He's an idiot. He went ahead and not put it center on. And to which, again, I did on purpose. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Also, in this angle here, you can see I added the drainage hole for the piece. I still need to add the drainage holes for the other ones, but this will be added by the next video. And from that quick little addendum takes us to another one, which is the equipment that we see here. What is this, you may ask? Well, this here is the mount for the turret. On my 1/6 scale model, specifically my scratch built or static ones, I like to have the turret be mounted to the model in a secure manner. It just makes the build a bit more complete, in my opinion. And in order to do this, I like to utilize the system that we have here. Obviously, this is the type of system that's unnecessary if you have something with a locking system like on the Dragon Panzer II or the Sherman. But for anything else, this system here I developed several years ago, actually a little longer than that, and it does the job quite well. What we have here is we have a aluminum bar that is bolted to the under portion here of the vehicle's roof, and we have a single fastener that is emerging from it. This fastener makes contact, or I should say is dead center here on the center portion here of the turret, and when the turret sits in place, it could then be fastened in place with a washer, a very large washer, and a single nut. With this design, the turret is secured to the model where it doesn't fall off or anything, and it's still able to freely rotate, which again is something that is very beneficial. On the design itself, you can see that it descends quite a bit from the roof here of the hull, and the reason is for that it needs to clear that bottom portion as we saw here on the turret. Bring it back in camera. So on the turret over here, you can see there's quite a lot of neck that descends from the turret base itself, and it needs to descend in order to clear that. The extra washer over here, well, it has several washers. There's a washer on the bottom of the fastener head. This gives more meat to grab onto the aluminum. There's a secondary washer right here just to eat up any more space that's in between the turret and the bar itself. And then the last two is a washer for the interior, and the nut, of course, that locks everything together. The piece is secured in place with some spacers, but because of the neck, I had to add quite a few more bits of hardware in order to achieve the right depth. We have here 2 nuts, as well as also some washers, and then there's, of course, a nut and another washer on the bottom, squishing everything in for good measure. Red Loctite's utilized because this thing does not need to go anywhere. On the top portion over here, we have 2 countersunk fasteners, and obviously this is done to have a low profile so the turret doesn't get struck by these pieces when the turret is being rotated, and it makes it stick. If anyone notices the masking tape over here, this is the only time you see masking tape actually used on my finished models. This is purely just done to hold the fastener in place. It makes it a bit easier to secure the turret in place without having to reach in with your hand from the engine deck area to hold this thing up and try to do this all in the dark to fasten the thing in place. Also, you'll notice I like to have the fastener sticking out of the tank as opposed to the opposite. Most people out there will try to do the opposite, where you stick the bolt through the turret and then try to do the nut underneath. That is doable. I have done that also in the past, but I always found this to be a bit easier because it's much easier to put your hand in through the turret, through one of the hatches to secure the nut in place, as opposed to, again, trying to take this thing from the bottom and trying to put your hand through the engine hatch and do it from underneath. It's much easier to do it in the former. So the masking tape is purely just there just to hold the fastener in place. It's cheap, but also extremely effective. And in the end of the day, it's just masking tape. There's nothing permanent. If I want to rip it out, I can rip it out for whatever reason there may be. One other thing someone might wonder is, why did I go ahead and have it descend from the turret here as opposed to mounting it either on the side sections or even attached to the sponsons, or even the floor for that matter? And the answer is quite simply put, the turret is the best way because this is not visible at all once the turret is fitted in place. If you go ahead and try to do a bulkhead technique, which is something, again, I've done in the past, it's doable, but you have to do now extra bodywork on the side section here of the hull in order to keep the thing fastened in place. And something else you may want to consider is that when the turret's sitting on it, it may be subject to some vibration or shifting just with the way the turret is designed and the way it moves. If the hull's not perfectly centered, you may have a slight little shift or deviation going on, and that can add some vibration and play to it. Well, that can wiggle itself loose and break some of the bodywork that you have on the side, and now you don't, as you can see, it's going to cause some issues. With this method over here, let's just say that does happen, it's underneath the turret, so it's not going to make a difference. Also, if it was mounted to the sponsons, same thing. Remember, I did that nice job with detailing the other sponsons. It'd be kind of anticlimactic to have a nice ugly bolt on the bottom, and same is also true for the lower hull. So that's why on my builds, I like to put it right here. It just solves a lot of problems. In order to get an idea how the turret fits in place, well, I'll just go ahead and drop it on right now. Once the turret finds its sweet spot with the fastener, it just drops right in. To which then I just go ahead and throw the fastener on, take the nut, screw it on, and just hand tighten until it basically hits the point where I'm happy with it. You could use a wing nut too. That will also work actually extremely well with this application, but for here, just a standard nut will work just fine. A nylock would also work, but you have to bear in mind you need to go in there with a wrench, so it's not necessarily a great idea. It's one of those things that sounds great on paper, but a standard nut will be more than suffice for the job at hand, but I could definitely see a wing nut having some advantages too. And once the piece is fit in place, it turns without any sort of complications. While working on the front section of the model, it takes us back to the blower. I went ahead and previewed this in the previous video, but I said I needed to have the area pre-painted here before installation. Well, here we are. So the area, not only was it primed and painted with the base coat, I also went ahead and hit it with the airbrushing, as well as the Tamiya panel line accent. For a reason that should be fairly obvious, once it's fit in place, you're not going to be able to get in here. And on that note, same was also done to the interior portion here of the blower itself. As I mentioned in the other video, the interior section is fully detailed on the blower, and this too has been painted, weathered, and currently the panel line accent has been added. In a moment, I'm going to go ahead, add the glues, and get this thing mounted on permanently. Also, at this location, you get to see the two the two backup periscope covers, and they have been fitted in place. They just drop into the appropriate locations. Jumping to the front glacis plate takes us to the travel lock, and as you can see, the travel lock has now been permanently fixed to the model and the installation is complete. Prior to the mounting of this piece over here, I went ahead and hit this area here with the airbrush with the base coat just to ensure that there's a nice coat of paint in this location, and also again because of the hollow feet that the inner recesses are painted. I do see some CA gas, so it is going to need a second quick polish coat, but again, it's just a way to cover my bases. On the travel lock itself, currently it's in, of course, the retracted state. However, the piece is fully functional, as I mentioned before. With the camera pulled back, I could go ahead and open the piece. The piece is held in place securely with the travel lock clip right over here, just like again on the real one. So as you can see, it retains it extremely well. To open it, I just press on the lock itself, and then the piece just hinges directly upward. With the unit unlocked, as you can see, it can hinge open absolutely freely. And to open up the lock itself, I pull down on the eyelet, and now, of course, the piece can freely open. Once the mantlet and the barrel are out of the way and fit in place, I can then show the installation of how the piece would function. But you can see my pinky over here. Basically, you would lower the 75 into this area. It would then close onto the unit to then you could push upward on the piece, locking it in place, thus ensuring that the piece is not going to move anywhere. Even though the spring clip isn't spring steel, it does have some springing nature to it, and that's exactly good enough for the application here at hand. To retract the piece, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that this thing is in the lock position. I just push down on the piece, and it's going to naturally snap into the location, like so. As you can see, it made a nice, satisfying audible click or clunk, which is actually something that I wasn't expecting to make, but here we are. Awesome. As I stated before, the travel lock is really just temporarily pinned at the moment. If I go ahead and push these pins out, I can go ahead and remove the unit for the time being. And obviously this is going to come in really handy when it comes time to actually complete the paint and weathering work on the model as a whole. But for the time being, I can just pin this guy back in place, as it really does a good job in preventing this thing getting lost. Or not so much lost, but misplaced in the shop. And with that latch over there, this thing really isn't going to go anywhere. Alright, so besides the travel lock, the only thing that's left on the front hull here to complete it is going to be the bow 1919, the 1919 tarpaulin cover clip, the front lift hooks, and the comb device. And that's it. After that point there, the front of the vehicle is completed. However, of course, that will all be the topic of another video for another day. Back on the transmission cover, as I mentioned before, it receives a comb device. Unfortunately, the comb device that I have here on hand is the later pattern one, and from what I saw from the World War II pattern photographs, either it doesn't have a comb device at all, or from the in-action photos, several did have the standard comb device, which is the one that just looks like, well, a blade, and that's just welded directly to the transmission cover. The version that I have on hand is the later design one that has that cool hinging feature, and that is something that was seen on several Jumbos, but that was, from what I was able to read, a post-war modification that was added to these vehicles amongst several other components when these vehicles entered into the 1950s life extension program. On that note, this also takes us to the tow cable lock. I went ahead and assembled this unit over here, and I mentioned it earlier in the video. However, I'm not going to be mounting this to the model. Usually on these vehicles, the tow cable lock would be mounted somewhere in this area here of the transmission cover. However, again, just like with the comb, when the units were entered into the 1950s life extension program, one of the mods that it received was the addition of this tow cable lock in this location over here. However, prior to that, during the World War II time frame, and this again is seen from all of the World War II period photos I've seen specifically in theater, was that the piece did not have it, or I should say the transmission did not have that lock in place. Instead, in order to secure the tow cable in place, they just double dutched the tow hook right here on the bottom. The tow shackle, which is generally used to help pull this thing out, was, when it's not being used for that, is where the tow cable eye would lock in here and a cross pin here would secure it in place. The rear section does retain the tow cable clip, as again this is a carryover from the late M4A3, and all Shermans have it back there, come to think of it. But so this component is still going to be mounted to this model, but just not in the front. Again, if I wanted to render this model as a post-war version, I could go ahead and secure that piece in that location there and call it a day. And you do get extra detailing, but again, for a World War II pattern vehicle, it really shouldn't get it. As a side note on the cable, I've seen some photos of I believe it was APG photographs of a Jumbo, more likely the pilot model, and it actually has this component fitted. However, that is the only period photo that has it, and you'll say, well, John, why don't you just add it because it's in that photo? Yes, but then it doesn't have the MG ring. And more likely that was a pilot model, and for whatever reason, when the thing got rubber stamped to head off into production, they just omitted that feature for one reason or another. But again, as for the topic of this build over here, it is not going to be receiving that bit of detailing in the front. And needless to say, this was a gigantic update. And it's also amazing just how far and fast the model has progressed since the previous video. The model in the previous video, as I mentioned before, was about 35, maybe 40% complete. At this point here, we're about 60 or 65%. It is really that humongous of an update. As we can see, the entire lower hull is done, and a good portion of the upper hull is also done at this point. The only thing that remains to be added, as I mentioned before, a few fittings on the front of the hull, finishing up the bow hatches, and also just fleshing out the tool posts, as well as the taillights. And that's it. At that point there's nothing left to do on the hull but paint it and put stars on it, really. Then, of course, the turret. Now, the turret is going to be the topic of another video that's going to be posted shortly after this one makes its debut. But the turret has also progressed immensely, and at this point here, spoiler alert, the turret's actually ready for its mantlet. So there's a ton of info to be mentioned on that. That should hopefully keep you guys entertained, and that'll be, again, a video that's going to be posted shortly after this one here, of course, makes its debut. And that is the perfect point to sign off on this project update video for the 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular project that have been posted since the project start, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.